Politics today feels like teams. Not just disagreement, teams. You're either on one side or the other. Conversations escalate quickly. Complexity gets treated like weakness, and a lot of people feel exhausted before the discussion even starts. Before we ask why politics feels this way, it's worth asking something simpler. How did we learn to think about politics in the first place? You're listening to Beyond the Binary. This is a series about political literacy, not persuasion. Not about telling you what to believe, but about understanding the systems that shape how political thinking happens. This podcast is a companion to our written and visual work where we slow things down and explain the patterns underneath what we're all experiencing. This episode is about education. Specifically how politics is introduced in U.S. secondary schools and colleges, and how the introduction shapes the way most Americans understand political life. This episode is not about media, social platforms, elections, or who's right or who's wrong. We're starting at the beginning, school, because for most people, that's where political language first enters their life in an organized way. For most Americans, their first exposure to politics wasn't a protest or a campaign or a policy debate. It was a classroom, a social studies class, a civics unit, a government course. Politics showed us the branches of government, political parties, elections, and debates between opposing viewpoints. And that matters because first exposures shape default assumptions. When politics is first encountered as two sides competing, that structure becomes familiar. And familiar structures tend to feel natural. Not because they are inevitable, but because they're practiced. Political scientists have a term for this process: political socialization. It sounds technical, but the idea is simple. Political socialization is how people learn what politics is, where it happens, and how participation is supposed to look. Schools don't just teach information about politics, they teach a framework for understanding political life. And that framework sticks, especially when it's learned early and reinforced repeatedly. This is where an important distinction comes in. Schools clearly teach content, facts, dates, amendments, institutions, definitions, but alongside content, schools also teach something less visible: constraints and boundaries. Boundaries are not rules written on the board, they're limits on what feels thinkable. They shape what questions get asked, what solutions feel realistic, and what ideas feel outside politics altogether. Boundaries don't tell students what to think. They quietly shape how far thinking is allowed to go. So what does this actually look like outside a classroom? It often shows up in subtle, familiar ways that don't feel political at the time. Take debate culture. A lot of students are trained to argue both sides of an issue. They're rewarded for clarity, confidence, and speed, for anticipating counter-arguments and landing a strong conclusion. What they're not rewarded for is questioning the frame itself. You learn how to win arguments, not how to redesign the system the argument sits inside. That's a boundary. Or take civic knowledge. Many people graduate knowing how a bill becomes a law, how elections work, how branches of government check each other. But far fewer learn how lobbying actually shapes legislation, how economic power limits political choice, how enforcement or lack of it determines outcomes. So students learn how the system is supposed to work, not how power actually moves. That's another boundary. And there's how alternatives are introduced. Third parties are framed as spoilers. Non-electoral action is framed as protest, not politics. And indigenous governments, cooperatives, and community-led systems are often treated as culture, not as serious political models. When alternatives are introduced only as exceptions, they stop feeling viable. None of it feels political at the time. It just feels like school. Think about standard civics. Students learn how elections work, how parties compete, how laws are passed. They might debate issues from two perspectives. They're encouraged to be respectful. They're taught to vote as civic participation. What they're rarely taught is how power operates outside elections, how economic leverage shapes policy, how communities govern themselves without the state, or how systems can be redesigned rather than defended. So politics becomes something you choose between, not something you build together. That's not a moral failure. It's a structural one. This framing isn't usually ideological, even though it can be. It's mostly logistical. They want to get you to a certain point. Curricula are standardized, textbooks need to be testable, courses are time limited, balance is emphasized. Binary structures are easier to organize, easier to assess, easier to explain, and easier to control. But simplification has consequences. When politics is simplified into opposing camps, alternatives tend to appear as side notes, not core systems. Over time, repetition turns structure into habit. Students practice identifying sides, defending positions, debating with preset options. Grades reward clarity, debates reward confidence. Ambiguity often feels risky. But by graduation, the political binary doesn't feel like a framework anymore. It feels like common sense. The result isn't just opinions, it's a political posture. People become comfortable with side-taking, identity alignment, and oppositional thinking. Disagreement starts to feel personal. Complexity starts to feel evasive, and cooperation across difference feels unnatural, even when everyone wants solutions. This isn't about bad intentions, though there are some bad actors. It's mostly about learned structure. Education introduces the frame, but school ends. So why doesn't the binary fade with age? If anything, it hardens. That raises the next question. What systems reward staying inside the binary long after graduation? You can find the visual companion to this episode on our first carousel on Instagram at WDP Frontlines, where these systems are mapped more directly. In the next episode, we'll be talking about why the binary never ends. Until then, stay curious.